the controls for the drift meter. This is very simple. You just press M to take over manual control, and then you push your joystick either left or right to make your drift adjustments. And you can see as I move it left, the drift scale or the drift pointer here moves and changes the drift setting. And you'll also see that these dotted lines also move in accordance with the setting of this drift pointer. I say I'm not going to go over how you do navigation, so I'll cover that kind of thing in later videos. But that's how you change your drift setting, simply with the left and right movement of your joystick. So now I'll go back to the instrument view, and so that's taken us to our desk, and we want to go to our zoomed in view of the map now. So welcome to the Navigator's interactive map view. Now what I'm going to show you here are the controls associated with moving around this view, and those that you can also use to do things like moving waypoints, changing elevation of waypoints, etc. However, I'm not going to go into the details of navigation and replotting of courses, etc. So the main controls for moving around this map revolve around the mouse and numeric keypad on your keyboard. Now the mouse has some limitations when you are in this view, and I'll touch on those in a short moment. First of all, we use the mouse to move the map around, and we'll do that by holding down the right mouse key and then moving the mouse around freely, and that allows you to move the map. Now the limitation of this is that you cannot move the cursor beyond the edge of the screen, and that prevents you from moving the mouse any further beyond those limits as well. So if you do want to move a greater distance, you can either progressively right click and drag and let go, right click and drag and let go. I'll just go back doing that as well, and that's very tedious. Or you can use the numeric keypad commands, and I'll show those to you in a short moment. The other mouse control is to tilt and rotate the camera, and you can do that by holding down the shift key and then holding down the right mouse key again, and if you move the mouse up and down you can tilt the camera, and if you move the mouse left and right you can rotate the camera. However, there is another significant limitation of the mouse, in that if you're zoomed out from the map to a certain degree, those mouse movement controls no longer work. So for instance, I'm going to zoom out right now by pressing the minus key on the numeric keypad, and if I try and use the mouse now, it doesn't do anything. I can't do any movement, and it's only when I zoom back in, try again, to a certain level does that movement come in. So it's a bit of trial and error, and that can be a bit frustrating. So you may want to exclusively use the numeric keypad. It's entirely up to you. Now I'll go over the numeric keypad controls. Now they revolve around the numbers on the numeric keypad along with the decimal point and the plus and minus keys. Now what I do suggest is that you grab the reference card for the game and have a good look at the camera controls that are listed there. They are all the controls that you'll use for moving the camera around these map views. Now one question for you guys is that the reference card lists the number 7 and 1 keys being used to move the camera up and down. Now that doesn't work at all on my system, and it may be the game itself and that's an error on the reference card, I don't know, but certainly when I go into the game options there is a camera up option and there's a camera down option, and they are set to use the number 7 and 1 keys on the numeric keypad, and yet they do nothing when in any of these map views. So it would be great to hear if you have any success with those, so let me know in the comments below. Anyway, moving on to the other keyboard controls associated with the numeric keypad, we'll do some movement now of the map. So we'll start with rotation, and pressing the 0 key rotates the camera to the left or clockwise, and pressing the decimal point key rotates the camera in the opposite direction. Now that moves fairly quickly, And you can slow down any of these movements using the numeric keypad by holding down the control key first. So I'm holding that down now, I'm pressing the 0 key, and you get a much slower, finer control over that movement. So the other movement keys are the 8 and 2 key moves the camera forward, and the 2 key moves the camera back. And the 4 and 6 keys move the camera to the left, and the number 4 key, and the number 6 key moves the camera to the right. You can also tilt the camera. You can tilt the camera using the 9 and 3 keys. So pressing the 9 key tilts the camera in that direction, and pressing the 3 key tilts the camera back down there. As I touched on earlier, the minus key zooms out and the plus key zooms in. As I say, pressing control with any of these slows them all down to fine control. So for instance, again, pressing the control key and pressing the plus key to zoom in, that moves in a much more controlled, slow manner. Now, one thing I just want to highlight to you is that there is a legend for this map in the bottom right hand corner. So just bear with me while I do a little bit of rotation and movement to get to that location. Oops, wrong way. And just do a little bit of movement there. And just do the movement there. Okay, so this legend shows you all the important features with regards to the game. In terms of the urban areas, lakes, rivers, forests, roads, railways, allied air bases for the fighters and the bombers, the Luftwaffe air bases, flak zones of varying intensity, your target locations, and the target locations that are available to you are always shown in 3D, and I'll show you one of those in a moment. If you're playing a mission which is after the 6th of June 1944, then there'll be a thick red line shown starting at the Normandy beaches to indicate the front line after D-Day. And as the missions progress through the days following the 6th of June, you'll see that front line moving inland, representing the historical position of it on the day of your mission. You also have thick blue lines which represent the Luftwaffe fighter zones. And we'll just zoom out now and just have a quick look at some of these features. We'll just move over and up. And so these blue zones represent the reach of the Luftwaffe fighters from the Luftwaffe air bases. So if you're flying your B-17 and it's outside of those zones, you can rest assured that you will not be subjected to any Luftwaffe fighter attacks. However, you may be subjected to those attacks anywhere within those blue zones. And the red zones are the flak zones, as I mentioned earlier on the legend. And so again, if you are flying outside of any of these red or pink zones, then you will not be subjected to flak. However, as soon as you enter one of these, you will very likely be subjected to flak. Now I'll just quickly show you the 3D bombing targets by zooming in over this area, and you can see there's this is over Germany, and I think this is actually Berlin. You can actually see there is a large cluster of 3D targets here, and they represent all the targets in the game. And so for our current bombing mission, I'll just move over to where we are here. You can see that our course will bring us from this northern area up here, flying south over Bremen and the various targets that are associated with this particular mission here. Now the red bomb indicates that is the primary target, the orange indicates the secondary, and the yellow indicates the tertiary. Now we'll just touch on a couple of other mouse controls that are available to you in this. I'm just going to go into manual mode by pressing the M key, and when you're in manual mode you can change the plotted course that is ahead of your bomber, and you can do that by clicking on any of these red arrows, which are your various waypoints in the game, and you can left click and drag that around, and you can change the position of that waypoint there. You can also change the elevation of a waypoint by left clicking on this symbol here and dragging it up and down, and that will change the elevation of that waypoint. And also mustn't forget that if you press the number 5 key on your numeric keypad, that actually recenters the camera zoomed in on your B-17's current location. Now there are all the controls that I wanted to show you when navigating around these maps. As I say, I will cover navigation in a later video. In the meantime, the only other view that's accessible to the navigator is the window view, and you can reach that by pressing the W key, and that gives you a nice view of the portside engines. So, without further ado, we'll now move on to the next crew station. So we're now going to look at the pilot's crew station, and to do that, so we're currently here in the nose compartment. What we're going to do is we're going to use the left crew station menu here, and we're going to go down to the third icon, which is the pilot's icon, and we're going to left click on that there. And that has taken us straight to the pilot's crew station, and this is the action view for the pilot. So in these action views for the pilot and co-pilot, you actually only really see window views. Now there's technically no window view accessed using the W key for the pilot and co-pilot. Instead you use the action view to get to the windows. And in these window views, the only purpose of them is literally to see outside of the plane from the pilot and co-pilot's perspective. And you can use the hat switch on your joystick, as I showed in the first getting started video, to have a look at the alternate window views that are accessible from here. Now, none of these instruments register the correct values. They're just dummy graphics on screen here, similarly with any of the light statuses and controls that are indicated here. None of them are functional. So the only purpose of these views is really to get those window views that you're looking for. And I'll just press the number 4 key now to switch to the co-pilot to show you the equivalent view from the co-pilot's perspective. So just jumping back to the pilot. So what we'll now do is we'll go to the only other views that are available for the pilot and co-pilot, and they are the instrument views. And we'll go to those by pressing the I key as usual. Now when you first come into the instrument view for the pilot, you'll be presented with this zoomed out view of the instrument panel from the pilot's perspective. Now the co-pilot has a similar zoomed out view, and you can access that by pressing the number 4 key at the top of your keyboard to switch to the co-pilot, and you'll get the co-pilot's zoomed out view there. So we'll just switch back to the pilot again by pressing the number 3 at the top of the keyboard. Now you also have a number of zoomed in views that are available, and they are accessed using the function keys, which become active when you are in one of these instrument views for the pilot or co-pilot. And the function keys that you have available are from the F4 key through to the F9 key. So first of all, we're going to start off in the pilot's zoomed out view, which is where we are. This is accessed using the F4 key, so if you are in any of the other instrument views, pressing the F4 key will take you back to this view. Now this is irrespective of whether the co-pilot or pilot is the selected crew member. For instance, if I go back to the compartment view, you can see that the pilot is selected. It's got the white outline around him. And if I go back to the instrument view, and so if I press the F5 key now to go to the co-pilot's instrument view, and I go back to the compartment view, you can see the pilot is still selected. So using the function keys doesn't change which crew member is selected. It's only if you use the number keys at the top of your keyboard will the crew member change, not using these instrument function keys. So we'll just go back to the instrument panel now by pressing the I key again. So I've just covered that the F4 key takes us to this pilot zoomed out view, and that the F5 key takes us to the co-pilot's zoomed out view. So what we'll now do is we'll go to F6, and that takes us to the engine instruments zoomed in view. Now I'll just go through briefly the gauges that are here. In the top of the screen you have the manifold pressure for the 4 engines,
And the manifold pressure is a moniker for the power output from those engines. And you have the left gauge covers the port side engines numbers 1 and 2, and the right hand gauge covers the starboard side engines numbers 3 and 4. And the next pair of gauges below those are the RPM for those engines. Again, the left gauge shows the port side engines 1 and 2, the right hand gauge shows the RPM for the starboard engines 3 and 4. Now beneath those gauges we have the flap position gauge, and that indicates whether the flaps are up, down or set at some intermediate position. Coming over to the central area we have the fuel pressure gauges, again for the port side engines and the starboard side engines. Beneath that we have the oil pressure, again for port side and starboard. And then beneath that we have the oil temperature gauges. Now all the temperature gauges are a little bit different in that there are individual scales for each engine. So the left gauge here has 2 scales and 2 needles. The left one for engine number 1 and the right one for engine number 2. And similarly the right hand gauge gives you engine 3 and then engine 4. Now because these dials are so difficult to read, you actually do get a pop-up reading if you hover the mouse over them in just the right position. It can actually be very tricky to get this pop-up to come up, but if you persevere you will get it eventually, and it does disappear quite easily as well. So I'm going to stop moving the mouse. What's useful about these is that they are color coded. Green tells you that you are operating within the desired operating temperature range for that component, for the oil temperature here. Now if that text is orange, it indicates that you've strayed outside of the desired range, but it's not critical. If it turns red, then you have strayed well outside of the desired range and the temperature is now critical and you must do something to address it. Now these temperatures are really critical when you have engine management active in the game, and that's activated by having your general difficulty settings set to either medium or high. And then these temperatures really do play a significant part in how you play the game. I don't plan on going over engine management. In this video I want to keep this focusing on the basics, so look out for the engine management video as I progress through this series. So the next 2 gauges beneath here, you have the cylinder head temperatures, again for the port side engines and then the starboard side engines here. And then the right hand pair of gauges gives you the carburetor air temperatures. Again, port side on the left, starboard side on the right. Now just moving up this right hand side here, we have a gauge which gives you an indication of the fuel quantity you have in the fuel tanks. Now the game only models 4 fuel tanks, tanks 1, 2, 3 and 4. It doesn't model these left hand feeder and right hand feeder tanks which did exist. So when you toggle through the fuel tanks using this fuel quantity selector, which you can do by using the left mouse button to make it turn clockwise or the right mouse button to make it go anti-clockwise, then you'll only be able to select tanks 1, 2, 3 or 4. As soon as I again left click to turn it further clockwise, it spins back to tank 1. And whenever this is set to a certain tank, this gauge will indicate the fuel quantity for the selected tank. So in this instance we have 4 tanks which all have a little over 350 gallons in each one. Now moving up to the gauge that's above the fuel quantity selector, we have a gauge which gives us the external air temperature. And this can factor into some of the engine management decisions that you make. Over on the right hand side here, we have a panel that allows us to turn off the carburetor air cleaners. Now these are filters which would normally be turned on when you're below 8,000 feet to stop particulates getting into the engines. And it can be toggled by left clicking on this switch. If I just put us into manual mode and left click, you can now see that the filters have been turned on and those lights go to orange. If I left click again, the light goes to green and the carburetor filters have now been turned off. Now one thing to notice is if you monitor the manifold pressures over here, is when I toggle that switch and turn those air filters on, you'll see a slight decrease in the manifold pressure. and that's because there's a pressure loss across these filters. But we'll just turn the filters back off for now. So the only other parts of this screen that are actually functional in the game are over on this left hand side here. Now we'll just run through this bank of lights first of all. On the left we have the landing gear status light, then we have a bomber call light, and we have a tail wheel lock light. Now starting off with the landing gear, when this is not illuminated, as it currently isn't, then this means that the landing gear is not lowered and locked. If this may mean that the landing gear is only partly lowered, you'll only know if it's lowered and fully locked in place when this light is on. Now you can lower the landing gear by first of all switching to manual mode by pressing the M key and then left clicking this switch. Now you have to keep this switch held down until you see the light illuminate to indicate that the landing gear is fully locked down. Then you can let go of the mouse. You can also raise the landing gear from here by right clicking on this switch, and as you can see the light went immediately off, but that doesn't mean that the landing gear is actually fully raised. You'll have to do a visual by going to the external view and double checking that that has happened. Now there is a keyboard shortcut to this, and it's actually much easier to use that than it is to use this switch, and the keyboard shortcut for this is the up key, which is used to raise the landing gear, and if you want to lower the landing gear you just hold down the shift key and tap the up arrow key on your keyboard, and then you can let go. And so this is just a toggle switch. It's not like where you actually have to hold this switch down until it's reached one of the extremes. With the keyboard commands you just tap them once and the landing gear will continue to move to its destination, either up or down. Now as far as I know, the bomber call light actually has no function in the game. If it does, then please let me know. I'd love to know if that's actually used. I've never actually seen it active in the game at all. The third light is the tail wheel lock light, and this is obviously only really used when you are taking off, and this is activated within the game only by the keyboard as far as I know, and that's activated by either pressing the Shift T key to turn the wheel lock off, and you have to again be in manual mode to do this. I'm going to press M again to go into manual mode, Shift T, and that's turned the tail wheel lock off. And if I just tap T now on my keyboard, it turns the tail wheel lock back on again. Again, just pressing M to switch back to automatic mode so we don't crash. The other pieces on here is this bank of 4 switches. Now the center 2 switches have no function. They are landing light switches and they're not actually active in the game. The left hand switch we've already covered, which is the landing gear switch. The right hand switch is actually a switch to activate the flaps. Now the advantage of using this switch is it allows you to set intermediate flaps. So to activate intermediate flaps, we'll press the M key, and so we'll press the left mouse button now and keep it held down until the flaps position reaches our desired point, and then we let go of the mouse button, and you can see that's now set the flaps to an intermediate position. If I want to retract the flaps, I just right click on this switch and it will retract the flaps, and again I can let go of that at any point and the flaps will hold position wherever that indicator has stopped. Now the disadvantage of using the keyboard shortcuts to set the flaps is that the keyboard shortcuts will only fully extend or fully retract the flaps. You can't set the flaps to an intermediate position. So to fully extend the flaps, we just hold down the Shift key and tap the F key on the keyboard. Now I've let go of the keyboard keys there, and it is now fully extending the flaps, and I've got no control about stopping where they do that. And to retract the flaps fully, I just tap F on my keyboard once and the flaps will now fully retract. So this is actually a very useful place to come if you want to set your flaps to an intermediate position. This is the only way I know of doing it. Now the only other piece on here is one of the cowl flap switches, and this is for engine 4. This is active on here, but I'll go over the cowl flap switches once I go back to one of the zoomed out views and we can see all 4 switches at that time. Now that covers everything on this screen. What we'll now do is we'll move to the next screen that's accessed using the function keys, and that is the F7 key, which takes us to the directional instrumentation in front of the pilot.
Now everything on this screen appears to be functional, but the actual value of this screen is pretty negligible in the game. Most of the items on here really don't play any part in the actual gameplay itself. I'll just touch on them anyway, just for your information. So on the top left here we have a radio compass, and this was normally used to give you the direction to the nearest radio beacon, which would obviously be on UK soil. But the odd thing here is if you note down this radio compass direction here, it's probably indicating something like 13. And if we then go to the navigator's position by pressing the number 1 key, you can see the radio compass pointer here is pointing to somewhere like 7, 7.5. So there's a discrepancy between the two. So the actual value of those radio compass indications is pretty ropey. So we'll just go back to the pilot now by pressing the number 3 and the F7 key again. The next gauge or dial here is the magnetic compass, and this has an adjustment knob. Again, the value of this is pretty ropey in terms of its value in game. You can left click on this compass adjustment knob to turn the manual indicators there round. Left clicking makes them go clockwise, and right clicking makes them go anti-clockwise. I'm not actually sure of the purpose of these, so somebody who does, it would be great if you could provide feedback in the comment section below and let me know. I've googled around trying to understand what this mobile part, manually mobile part of this magnetic compass is for. I couldn't really find anything, so yeah, I'd love to know. The third gauge over here is what's called the pilot's direction indicator, and this was really a communication device between the bombardier and the pilot, and really anything that is off center was an indication from the bombardier to the pilot that he needs to make a heading adjustment, and this was really to keep the plane on course to the bombing target. I believe that in the Northern Bomb Sight this automatically sent an output to this gauge so that the bombardier didn't need to do so. But again, really in game this serves no useful purpose, because when you are doing a bomb run and you're controlling the bombardier and you have the autopilot turned on, as it always is in a bomb run, you really don't need to take any account of this, and there's no separate pilot character who is needing this information. You're controlling it all from the bombardier station. The other gauges down here are literally this is the main electrical power supply to the electrical systems on board. You have the hydraulic oil pressure gauge here, and this is really used only for the cowl flaps and wheel brakes. The hydraulic oil system was really only used for those. So all of the other mobile systems, such as raising and lowering the landing gear, etc., were electrically operated, and that includes the flaps on the wings as well. The next gauge is actually a vacuum suction gauge. I'm not 100% sure what the vacuum system was used on board here. It was certainly, some of it would have been used for the function of the instrumentation. I don't know if there are other systems on board that use this vacuum, but this is an indication of the current vacuum being pulled by the vacuum pump. You also have two pairs of gauges at the bottom here, which were literally indicators of the oxygen supply to the pilot and co-pilot. And again, although these are live, I don't believe the game actually has any impact on the supplies. Same thing with the hydraulic oil pressure. I don't believe damage to the airplane is modelled in such a level of detail that these individual systems can be taken out. It would be great if that was modelled. It would be great if somebody could tell me that it is modelled, but I have never flown a mission where I've observed or been told that these systems have gone down and you need to take any action associated with that. Now you may be wondering what this word bomb is. Well, I'm just going to bring up on screen now a mod that I have done, which I'll be releasing once I start going through my Let's Play series after this Getting Started video series. And this overlay shows the lamps that are actually missing from this display. And as you can see, there are 6 lamps, and the first lamp on the top left is the light on bomb's door open lamp, and that corresponds to the bomb door lamp that's on the bombardier's instrument panel. There's also a bomb release light, and again that corresponds to the bombardier's instrument panel signal. And this is where I think that the bomb word was left over from. I think Wayward Design must have intended to have these lamps on this panel, or they did have the lamps on this panel at one time and they had to take them off, but for some reason this word bomb remained and it just looks really peculiar on its own. There is also a hydraulic oil pressure emergency system light. Now the hydraulic